Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ascend Guiding Coalition member, Dr. Shawna Pandya, to the stage.
Hello, Ascend. How are we doing this morning? Okay, we're gonna take that back a notch. Pretend you've had 10 cups of coffee. Just take a second, recalibrate. Ascend, how are we doing this morning? Yeah! Woo! Okay, that's the energy. Okay, so welcome, conference day 3. You guys don't look a day older than a day 2 conference. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You look fantastic. All right, today we have a fantastic, some might say stellar panel. What has space done for me lately? So sure, I think one or two of you may agree with me that space is cool. Some may argue, yeah, okay, I'm gonna speak entirely to that individual for the rest of this because they are bringing the energy. Okay, so some of us may say that space has done, one or two things for us. Human spaceflight, scientific return, telecommunications, defense, Earth observation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine, space, we're doing cool stuff. But are we doing it efficiently enough? The house is literally on fire. Pandemics, climate change, global strife, oh my, it's a long list. So let's talk about how we can do space better. And with me today, I have a out-of-this-world panel. I'm here all day with the space puns, by the way, starting with Bryan Bender, Vice President of Strategic Communications at SMI and former editor at Politico. Bryan, welcome to the stage. Next up, we have the one, the only Emma Louden, science communicator and Ph.D. candidate in astrophysics. Way to pick the easy stuff, Emma, at Yale University.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have the one, the only, go easy on him. I think he's new to this, Dan Dumbacher, Executive Director of AIAA. Dan, welcome to the stage.
Good morning, Ascend. How are you doing?
All right, please have a seat. Let's get into this. So I promise you a interesting, thought-provoking, maybe emotional roller coaster of an hour. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll get the t-shirt. But let's jump right into it. Let's start with the easy stuff. Pulse check on humanity and our space activities. How are we doing? What's your report card? Bryan, let's start with you.
How are we doing? I often think that when you read the headlines these days, it underscores how visionary many of the plans that we have for going to space really are, because I feel like we really do need to get off this rock, because it's sort of going to hell in a handbasket. But I mean,
tell us what you really think.
I say that kind of jokingly, but at the same time, I would say I think we're doing quite well in terms of developing space in a way that helps humanity. I don't think we're doing as well in telling that story to the public at large as to why these investments, why these business models matter for you, and what is it going to do for you. So I think I'd love to talk a little bit more about how we tell that story.
For sure. So I think you were the easy marker when it came to students in grade school, because maybe some of us have a more doom and gloom perspective on how we're doing as a species. Emma, what do you think?
Well, I think that Bryan is right in that we have a lot of visionary work happening in the space industry right now, but it's happening in the context of a world where we are battling climate change. We just dealt with a global pandemic that rocked the world. We have the highest levels of anxiety. We have the highest levels of income inequality. And all of this amazing work that we're doing in the space industry is happening in that very intense and very personal context for so many people. And I think that you're totally right. We have to be very conscious of how we're talking about space in that context, because we know that space is important for solving and helping address a lot of those challenges. It's a source of hope when there's darkness in the world, but at the same time, we have to be aware of all that is happening in our planet that is having all these problems that leads people to think about going elsewhere. But we have to be careful, I think, not to neglect what is happening right here.
All right, thank you, Emma. And Dan, What do you think? We doing okay?
Well, with a little bit longer perspective in some respects, one of the things I think I've noticed, Shawna, particularly in the recent, is how much progress we've made. If you look back 40 years ago, in this industry, we were doing shuttle, station, and Hubble. Well, not even station at that point. And now, if you look across the landscape, you see a fantastic array of commercial private entities come into bringing new technologies to bear. You see the government trying to move things forward to achieve its mission. And the opportunities today far exceed what they used to be even 30, 40 years ago. So fantastic on that front. We just have lots of problems that we have to address. And in particular, from my perspective, we have problems that we need to address to be able to turn over a little bit better situation to the next generation coming behind us.
So in all of your opinions, so Dan, is it a storytelling problem, or is it a more investing wisely and intentionally problem when it comes to using space for solving humanity's challenges?
Yes. It's those two and probably some others. But I think certainly the storytelling, I think Bryan is right on the mark, because we do a great job of talking to ourselves and telling us how great we are, telling each other how great our spacecraft and our rockets and all of this are going to be. All important to do. However, the investment is really being made from a business perspective now. It's being made from a government taxpayer perspective. And I always think of the taxpayers as investors anyway. So we have to be able to tell that story better and to convince people that that the why and the value coming out of this is good. We like to talk about the how a lot. We need to get to the why.
Okay, perfect. So let's pull on that thread or rip off that Band-Aid, whatever mixed analogy you want to use. So let's talk about the storytelling. What do we need to do better, Bryan? How do we want our story to be told to the public? And how do we make those connections with everyday life?
You know, I think it's common, and maybe it's becoming a little less common, to hear people when the issue of space comes up and they don't necessarily feel like they have a stake in it, or they don't know much about it, that it's this either or. You know, this question of why are we investing all this stuff to go there when we have all of these problems here? And I think the storytelling needs to merge those two in a much more effective way and make it clear that it's not either or, that what we're doing up there and what we hope to do up there has a direct impact on really saving this planet. You mentioned climate change, a huge role for space. I don't think that's as well understood by the general public, which does seem to be paying attention to climate change. I mean, they see it in their everyday lives. So connecting things like that, this is not about, oh, we just want to explore the heavens and send astronauts, you know, to go float around the Earth just for the heck of it. There are real benefits to the Earth. And of course, beyond climate change, we all know that whether it's medicine or other scientific discoveries, there's lots of opportunities in space. Many companies that are here are doing those things, doing that research. And so, to me, I think the real challenge is making this conversation about an ecosystem, if you will, that includes both the Earth and space. It's all, in some ways, the same, feeding on each other in a very positive way for everyday people.
We're going to go to Emma in a second, but before we do, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So just by hand gestures, how well are we telling the story of climate change versus telling the story of space? Like, where would you guys rate this? Because it sounds like, I think, you know, there's a variety of opinions. Where would, you know, are we even? Is there gross disparity? Where would you guys?
Well, I mean, climate change, I think people are really beginning to, like I said, feel it in their everyday lives. It's much easier to reach someone.
But not space, you would say.
But not space.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's just more kind of disconnected a little bit, like, you know, what's up there?
I'm seeing nods, so it seems like you all agree. So I'm going to make it harder for you. We're going to solve all of these problems on stage today. How would you, in addition to, are we telling that story well enough? How would you connect those dots, Emma?
So I think that what we've seen in climate change communication is what has been effective is showing people how climate change impacts their lives. Because if you talk about a changing atmosphere, how that's going to change global climate patterns, people feel disconnected from that. But I think what has been, and I mean this has been well researched too, what has brought people into understanding climate change is seeing the impacts in their everyday lives and getting connected to those. So as a space industry, while our vision of exploration is a lot less existential than solving climate change, we can learn a lot from those communication strategies and how to connect the dots between people's everyday lives and the things that they're feeling, the things that they're worried about, the things that they're interested in, and what we're doing in the space industry. And if we can help make those connections and change the picture of what this industry looks like, what the goals are, what the visions are, then we can, I think, begin to connect those dots. And there's ways to do that technically. We can think about how we can better tell the story of how, for example, satellites are a huge part of learning to mitigate climate change because of the data they can give us, and some people will really connect to that technical side. We can also appeal to the more psychological aspect of it, where if people look up into space, and then as more people will go to space through the overview effect, there's a connecting thread that happens there that can give people some very practically grounded hope, because there's technical solutions that go behind it, but to work together as a planet to be facing these very global issues.
So what I got from that, Emma, is we should have a day without space where we just take away everyone's GPS, ATMs, telecommunications. Tough love, resulting in chaos, but I like it. Dan, over to you.
Well, I'm going to throw some examples on how these things connect. A good friend of mine, and he may be in the room, he's been here this week, Jim Green, taught me one day about how our planetary scientists, looking at Venus, realized and helped us understand our problem concerning the ozone hole on Earth. That came from planetary scientist exploration. And then we solved the problem here on Earth because of what we learned on another planet. One example. Another example of how we can get this better connected to people is, and Shawna, you probably know this better than I do, is research on the space station, and what we're learning up there in microgravity is actually helping us understand the human aging process here on Earth. So helping draw those connections and making those connections more clear and more personal. But we've got parts of the story. We just need to do a better job of using them.
Can I say another example? Because this made me think, is part of a common narrative. You mentioned climate change. I think people understand that, you know, the effects of climate change are causing rises in breathing problems, in asthma. And, you know, you could directly go from there to, well, you know, it's imaging satellites in space that can tell us now which factories are belching the worst stuff into the sky over your community that is exacerbating that problem. So I think there are ways to sort of almost just continue the narrative with the space element that I think people can really understand and sort of accept.
Well, even last night with the Pickering lecture, we got to see with the surface water measurements that we're now making from orbit with our new measurement systems, how much the sea level's changing, how the temperatures are changing. And when you start to talk to the scientists and they start talking about 3 centimeters or 3 millimeters worth of change, and then translating that into human terms, it's a big difference. We need to be telling that story.
Sure. So I'm going to play a bit of the contrarian here. So there's some things that we absolutely need space for. Earth observation and climate monitoring is one of them. But I'm going to quote you one of the great classics of our time. You were so obsessed with whether you could, you didn't think about whether you should. Jurassic Park, circa early 1990s. So I feel like a lot of the progress, this exponential increase of branching out into space with militarization, commercial, exploration class missions, some of it is the cool factor. And speaking specifically to medicine, my own field, we could argue that maybe this is a little bit too much focus on an overly expensive, laboratory up in space when if we just invested a bit more wisely and a bit more meaningfully in Alzheimer's, in ALS research on Earth, perhaps we could solve the problem a bit more directly. There is a lot of pomp and circumstance about the fact that we're doing biomedical in space, for example, or science in space. So is there the sense of we could probably be focusing our research and development efforts a bit more wisely? Emma, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, so I think that there are two really important things to point out when that kind of argument is brought up. First is that we're doing all of this with an exceptionally small amount of money in the context of the global economy. If you look at NASA's budget in comparison to the general US budget, it's less than half of a penny of a tax dollar. And we're doing all of this amazing science with an exceptionally limited budget. So I would go the other way and say we should be spending more money on these kind of research expeditions, because then on the other side of that is that when we have a world that is full to bursting, it seems, with issues that are anxiety-inducing, they make it so easy when you're looking at headlines to just feel like nothing is happening and there is no progress. It is very important to be addressing those issues, but we have to, at the same time, give people a sense of something to be working toward. We can't just be running around putting Band-Aids on issues all the time, or we will burn out and be too tired to keep making the world a better place. And one of the most amazing things that space can do is give that sense of very practical hope to keep people moving forward and working on the issues we face on Earth, in addition to engaging in this amazing research expedition in space.
So you're saying, Emma, that it's not a matter of investing more wisely, but inspiring people more, telling them the why of why space matters, why space R&D, workforce capacity, investment matters. Is that the line?
Yeah, and another way to think about it is that if we want to face all of these issues that we have here on Earth, we need to learn how to think differently. And in order to think differently, we have to have different sources of input, basically, to our brains. Like, we have to find new ways to approach these issues. And space exploration is a great way to get us out of our heads, out of our everyday environments, and thinking about problems from a new perspective. It helps us think about, from a very big picture, how our planet fits into the universe. And then with that, there's a new perspective that we can use to approach these problems.
Dan, I saw you nodding in agreement. Are we investing wisely enough? Should we do it differently? Is it the storytelling, the inspiration, the why that needs to be done better?
Well, I think we're investing. Wisely is a subjective term. I think we could do better. Let me go down that road. We are in this transition from government drives everything to a commercial-oriented set of opportunities. And we're still trying to figure out the markets, we're still trying to figure out the business models, we're still trying to figure out all of those challenges. And oh, by the way, we're trying to solve the technical problems at the same time. And all of that has to get interlinked. So how we balance that portfolio is up for debate, and how that portfolio is handled. But with the great minds in this room and outside of this room, we have the opportunity to do this. We have the mental capacity to go do this. How do we pull it together and orchestrate it so that it goes in the good direction? Because ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish is the cislunar economy, or the space economy, become self-sustainable. What does that mean? How hard is that going to be? How long is that going to take? What's needed to make the business models work from a market perspective? And there are lots of creative ideas out there. And I think part of the investment at this point is you got to try a lot of different things to see what's going to work, because nobody knows what the magic app is right now. And then see how that plays out, and then let the marketplace figure out what the next steps are, and who's going to be leading, and who's behind, and who stays and who doesn't.
That sounds really challenging, Dan. It's a lot of effort.
if you like complex problems, what better place to be?
Bryan, what are your thoughts? Are we investing, could we be investing more wisely? Are we doing it well enough, especially in light of the complexities that Dan just mentioned?
I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer. The reporter in me wants to go back to basics a little bit, the sort of the who, what, when, where, how, and then maybe add the why. And that goes not just for storytelling to the wider humanity, but also storytelling within the space community.
Right.
What are the priorities? In other words, what do we think are the investments in a cislunar economy that will have the greatest payoff for humanity? And I am sure if you did that exercise, and can do it in a way where everyone really did contribute in a sort of honest way, and maybe for a second, and this is a little dreamy, but for a second put aside their sort of business interests and took a broader look, I think we might come up with a different set of menus of where do those investments need to be prioritized differently, a little less here, a little more here. And this is tough stuff because a lot of what everyone here is doing is kind of, I wouldn't say unproven, but a lot of it is still like theoretical. Could we manufacture a house on the moon? You know, could we make these commercial LEO habitats really work and really have a sustainable business model that doesn't rely solely on NASA to run? And so, you know, I think it's difficult, but I think going back to basics might be one step in figuring out, are we, you know, making the right investments, or do we need a different mix?
So part of the challenge as we're building the spacecraft on the way up is we're going to make mistakes, and some of them are going to have greater consequence than others. You know, a mistake in commercial space and suborbital flight is going to set the whole industry back, you know, a decade with a great enough magnitude. So how do we also prepare for when we make mistakes in space development, especially if we're purporting to do this to solve challenges on Earth? Starting with the easy questions here. Who wants to take this one? Dan, you look uncomfortable.
I'm about to get myself in trouble. That's a really good question, because now we're starting to get to the challenges in the near term of what we need to address. And you heard Pam Melroy talk about some of this yesterday when she started talking about who are the regulatory authorities, what needs to be done, how do we get that clarified for the commercial entities to go forward. For example, the FAA right now has a couple of activities going on to look at the possibility or the need and asking the hard questions of what are the should there be regulations? When should they be there? What should they be? And I think we're trying to figure out what, the group's trying to figure out what that is, and there will be debates over how much standards and best practices and regulations affect innovation. But there are also some things we know that we probably don't want to go back and fall into that rabbit hole again. Like, we don't want to be designing habitats with 100% O2 environments. We kind of learned that on Apollo 1. We also have learned the need of having abortability from the pad to keep the crew safe if something goes wrong on top of that rocket. So where do we draw that floor? What does it look like? And I think we're starting to grapple with those problems. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives. As Bryan said, kind of putting down the individual agendas and looking at the greater whole for what's important. Because one of the things I think we all need to realize is that we all affect each other in this ecosystem. We saw the recent example of the submarine going to the Titanic and what happened when people didn't pay attention to best practices that were actually very well known. Now that's going to affect that industry. So we need to be cognizant that consumer confidence we're trying to build to help build this ecosystem for the future, and we're all in this together. And what one entity does can affect others and affect business cases, investor confidence, insurance companies' confidence, et cetera. And we're just going to have to work through this. That's why, frankly, we at AIAA have these kinds of forums, is to let's roll up our sleeves and let's work on it.
All right, so plow forward and walk it off when bad things happen. That's what
I'm
I got from that.
just do it.
Okay, just do it. All right, Team Nike over there.
Just I'm giving that to Nike and University of Oregon.
Emma, what do you think about how we should plan for mistakes as we expand forward with our progress in space?
I think we walk a balance of making sure that the decisions we're taking, the risks we're taking are grounded in the analysis that we can do beforehand, but there will be lessons we learn that we don't plan for. That's how the nature of a field that is largely theoretical right now, and as it becomes more concrete, we will make mistakes. And there can be really severe consequences with those, but I totally agree. I think we just keep going and we do our best, and what we can't do is risk getting paralyzed by fear, but at the same time, don't plow ahead too quickly without thinking about those risks. So finding that middle ground where we can still innovate and explore.
All right, so your message to humanity is you're doing great, sweetie. Okay. Bryan, what about you? How should we plan for mistakes?
Well, I mean, I think one, it gets back to storytelling. I think you do need to manage expectations a little bit. I mean, you don't want to, jinx yourself, but you do want to make clear that this is very risky, particularly when we get to the point where we're sending far more humans into orbit. Although that's beginning as well. I think managing risk is different when you're talking about purely commercial endeavors versus government-run endeavors. Mm-hmm. I think on the commercial side, I think we'd all agree there's a greater tolerance for risk. We'll see how great, unfortunately, we'll probably see how great that tolerance is. The government, not so tolerant. I mean, somebody gets killed, you're going to have 3 years of a commission before you can do anything else, right? And that also brings up, and maybe this is a little off topic, but Dan, you made me think of this. All of these great ideas that are in the works, some more mature than others, are hampered by one big thing, which is government dysfunction. You talked about regulations. I mean, until the government gets its shit together, so to speak, on space traffic management, on so many other things, the industry is also kind of a little bit in a situation where it has one arm tied behind its back, at least on certain things. And then, of course, add on to that the whole international framework, how do international companies and governments sort of agree or disagree on different approaches. So, I think that factors into the risk as well. I mean, what is the government going to tolerate? What are they going to want from us? What are they going to demand from us in terms of safety, et cetera? We still don't know the answer to those questions, and I don't think the government knows, quite frankly, which is unfortunate.
So what I got from that is you want the government to do better, shaking your fist at the government.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a 10-day conference in and of itself. But yeah.
That'll be the next Ascend.
Yes.
No, whoa. No, let's be careful with that one. I don't know that we want to get into politics around here.
Putting more work on you, Dan.
It would be nice if the gears got a little more oil in general, so that some of these unanswered questions about regulations, got moved down the field. I mean, space traffic management, it's like Groundhog Day. We're talking about it, we're setting up offices, we're setting up new studies, and it's like, when are we going to get a plan here?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm just going to pause for a second, because I'm sure there's many of you in the audience just sitting back there looking, saying, I could do a better job of moderating than this random Canadian up here on the stage. Well, here's your chance. Take a minute, scan your questions into the QR codes at your tables. We will be going to questions shortly, so just a reminder, you have as much of a voice in this conversation as the rest of us. All right, so let's switch tracks then. Let's take a step back and talk about the big picture. What even are we working towards? The best way I heard this phrased was in conversation earlier this year is, what is the product roadmap for humanity? What are we aiming for on planet Earth? What are we aiming for in low Earth orbit, cislunar economy, and beyond? We're talking about just plowing forward. doing our best, getting better regulatory frameworks, but are we just fumbling blindly in the dark? Are we just saying, hey, this seems like a good idea and we should just go with it? Or is there something that we're working towards? Or is there a vision of something you'd like to see? So you all look lost in thought. I'll go to the person who looks least ready to answer this. Dan, we'll start with you.
I look the least interested. Okay. I'm actually going to tie it back to our first morning. I mean, we had the Kara and company kind of looking forward to the future, and I think from my own personal perspective, that pointed out a lot of the opportunity that's out there and where we can take this. What it's going to look like, who knows? I'll be the first to admit I come from that Star Trek generation that was a little optimistic, but still dealt with some of the challenges. And I think in the future, what we're trying to do is solve problems for Earth, number one, and for humanity, and then figure out where humanity's going from here. I talk about it in terms of extending the human neighborhood. First we go from the ground to low Earth orbit, and then on to the moon, and then beyond. And it's really, when I say extend the human neighborhood, it's not just us, it's just not us engineers and scientists. Yeah. It's police officers, it's cleaners, it's bankers, it's your hair salon, everything that it takes for a neighborhood to exist. And that's really, we're building the foundation of that here. And what it's going to look like, I think eventually humans will be living on different planets, extending out through the solar system. I really look forward to 2060 when Scotty claimed that warp drive was invented. So, we got 30 years. Let's get on with it. But there's a future out there with lots of challenges that need to be addressed from a societal perspective as well as a technical perspective. So I'm very optimistic. I also want us to be realistic about where we are and make sure we're working the problems that we need to work so that we can get there.
Right. So on that, are we going to the moon with or without COVID? Are we bringing our geopolitical problems with us, or are we leaving them behind? Like, how are we? We can't just forget about the fact that we are a very flawed species, and we bring chaos with us where we go. We went to space. It started with a Cold War showdown, right? Mm-hmm. And then at some point we thought, well, let's collaborate. But even when we collaborate, we have massive problems with space traffic management, with orbital debris. We make a mess. We're not a clean, organized species, Dan. So I appreciate that optimism. However, we need to also be mindful of, we need to learn from the mistakes we made and create a framework. So with that in mind, Emma, how are we creating our product roadmap for humanity in space and on Earth?
I'm also going to harken back to the conversation on Monday morning, because they brought up two really important points that I think underline or underscore how we are going to be able to make that product roadmap. The first is that we have to be able to envision the futures that we might want to create. They talked about the importance of shows like Star Trek and how it showed people a potential future and gave people something to be working towards. And then the second piece is a visual that was shown during that presentation, where it was the timeline of what's happened in the past and then different tracks for the future. And I think that maybe something that can help this industry, the whole enterprise of exploration in space, to better define that product roadmap is to sit down, and maybe this is a session at Ascend next year, like you were saying, with sitting down and saying who, what, where, when, why, and defining what are those potential future tracks, where are we going, what are the goals. I think it goes right back to that question in that statement about being able to clearly say what are we working towards, and how can we then tell that story so that we bring people along with us and we don't just go as scientists and engineers, that we bring humanity with us and learn from the past that way.
Well said, well said. Bryan, over to you. What are your thoughts on this engineering, this product roadmap for humanity?
Yeah, so what are we looking to do, or what are we hoping to accomplish? I mean, I think, Dan, you referred to a self-sustaining cislunar economy. I mean, obviously, sooner rather than later, I think we do need to get to a point where it is somewhat self-sustaining, because the government ain't going to pay for it all. The taxpayers aren't going to pay for it all. I also think there's a challenge, and this gets back to the who, what, when, where, why, of not deconflicting, but doing a better job of explaining the benefits of low Earth orbit and closer in versus the Star Trek way out there, we're going to explore the planets. Because the truth is, most of us aren't going to live long enough to see that. Or if we do, we'll see the initial phases of that.
Wait, what have you heard? What do you know about my health that I don't?
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, you're the medicine expert, but I've always thought all these grand visions of sending humans to Mars have many, many missing links in terms of actually how we can do that, human physiology being a big one. But, you know, I think setting expectations means also, I'm not saying you want to douse all of the public's fascination with exploring other planets and when are we going to get to Mars and who's it going to be. But I think that tends to be a much bigger focus when the real benefits are actually much closer in. At least the benefits that I think are either here already or just around the corner. And then I think we talked about climate change. People are interested in sustainability. And I think talking about space also in that way is helpful because we have created kind of a pigsty down here. And I think people might be interested to hear more about, okay, we're going to do all these things, but how are we going to do it in a much more sustainable way than we've done here? Again, trying to find ways that really resonate with not just the public at large, but members of Congress, investors who are all interested in this stuff. But again, managing expectations on what's possible anytime soon versus what are we working towards. Right. Because, you know, a lot of that, what we're working towards still is pie in the sky, literally.
Yes, and I appreciate the keeping it clean with pigsty. Thank you, by the way. But let's look at one of the gaps that I think we all agree exists is, you know, if we're looking at creating a cislunar neighborhood, if we're looking at having hairstylists on the moon, nobody knows how to style hair in 17% gravity. We don't know how hairspray and particulate matters behave in lunar gravity. So there's a gap in the workforce, and not just for lunar hairstylists, but for the scientists, the lawyers, the storytellers, the artists, the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. How should we work to close that gap? Emma, we'll start with you.
I think part of it is getting off of a high horse that positions science and engineering above any of those other jobs. Because right now, there's this misconception that to work in the space industry, you have to be a scientist or an engineer. And we're seeing right now that we have a lot of technical challenges that we still have a lot to learn to be able to do things like go to the moon, go to Mars. But we also have a lot of policy challenges to solve orbital debris, to deal with space traffic management, to think about what we're going to do with the moon when we get there, when multiple countries are there. We need people who are thinking from other mindsets, who are coming from business backgrounds, from policy backgrounds, from law backgrounds. And then as we build this economy, if we really want it, we need to have people from all walks of life who are interested and invested and excited in this. And I think that goes right back to the storytelling, because that is getting people excited about this work right now. It's getting people who maybe didn't picture themselves in the space industry of even 10 years ago to see themselves leaving college and saying, I want to go be a part of this. And I think that a critical piece of that is being able as an industry to articulate what it is we are doing and why we are doing it. Because we know that the story of like the Apollo inspiration, while that got a lot of people into this industry, it's not what is going to drive that for the future. When we have a group of young people who are graduating from their college's experiences now, who are entering into a world, like we said, with extreme income inequality, global pandemics, climate change, we need something that is going to bring them into this industry that is connected to those issues. We need a story that conveys that and can draw people in so that we have the right minds participating in this really cool adventure that we're all on.
So that's a really good point, Emma, and we'll talk about capacity building with Bryan and Dan. And then the other thing I think we should think about is we've probably been speaking about how we advance as humanity in space from a very US-centric viewpoint so far. And so we have to realize that maybe not every actor in space has the same goals as we do.
Yeah.
So when we talk about going collaboratively and building a future for humanity, we should also think about how we align goals where right now not everyone's goals are aligned. So let's focus on the capacity building first, and let's move over to that. Bryan, what are your suggestions for building that workforce and that capacity?
Well, you know, we talked about this, this came up in our earlier conversation this week, but I feel like even though a lot of this is still theoretical, or, you know, the proof of concept isn't quite there yet, I do think the space industry has matured to the point where, and the benefits to humanity are great enough already, that we should start thinking out of the box in terms of how to involve communities in this conversation in a way that we haven't yet. I use maybe it's not the greatest analogy, but the Sierra Club analogy, or the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts of America. There needs to be, at a very ground level, the beginnings of building a network where people, where they live, become aware, active, interested, help shape how we, humanity, focus on space, what we do up there. That would be my recommendation, to start thinking about that in terms of capacity, because yes, STEM is an issue and workforce is an issue, and I know there's lots of things going on at companies trying to deal with that. The government is also trying to play a role in building that generation of men and women that we're going to need to do all this great stuff. But I think even taking it a step or two further back is going to have payoff way down the road.
And so just to pull on that thread of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America, you're envisioning the Space Scouts of America. You're also talking
the
about
Space Scouts,
down.
or
Yeah.
maybe it's the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts just get a space badge because they learned about navigation from a satellite, or they learn about what we've learned down here that we're using in our everyday lives to survive, that we got from our space exploration.
And have them have their excitement, just evangelize and, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could reinvent the wheel with the space, Space Scouts, but maybe you just sort of build on what we already have. But I don't know, it's a good discussion.
We're an ideas panel. You're free to take that idea, run with it, but you heard it here first. Dan, capacity building. How do we get
capacity building, I'm going to come at it from two different directions. Number one is there is a great untapped pool of talent out there that this industry has not tapped. And we are working to tap it in the underserved, underrepresented communities. This is an and conversation, because there's great talent in this room, there's great talent at all of our organizations, and every single one of the organizations that I hear from talks about the need for additional talent. All of the skills you mentioned, as well as where are those hands-on technicians to go build the hardware? Where do I get that? So we need to be reaching out to the underserved, underrepresented communities that typically don't get involved with space because they're not aware of it, and we need to help bring them along. That's going to have to be an intentional effort. That is a huge, when we start talking about our workforce capacity, that is a key element that we need to work on. There is the other part of the capacity building, and that is our investment in the research that's needed to go figure out what we need to do and how to solve the technical problems. How do I develop, and what do I need to do to demonstrate how to make a fuel depot on orbit actually work? How do I do that? How do I figure out the human physiology and microgravity? One of my favorites, how do I deal with the human psychology of a long trip from Earth to Mars and back, when getting in an airplane to go to Australia starts to make a lot of us wheezy?
duct tape? I hear duct tape works wonders, Dan.
So we've got capacity, and that capacity, both versions of capacity that I'm talking about require investment. So how do we sort those out? But bringing in a great untapped pool of talent that's out there, and then getting the right technical research up and running, I think is going to be key, along with the business models and the economics and all of the policy issues. This all has to work together.
So you brought up a really important point, but I'm going to pull on an uncomfortable aspect of that thread. You talked about leveraging and approaching and uplifting communities that have not been part of this conversation. Could we be accused of speaking from a point of privilege when we try to approach these communities? Because a lot of the folks who would benefit from space are focused on some other things like survival and economic income. And there's a lot of disparity when we look at who has, the position of priority and superiority in the space race. And so, we've heard a lot at this conference, everyone can, emerging space nations can benefit from spacefaring capabilities, even if it's not through human spaceflight, but through Earth observation telecommunications. But even that requires upfront investment. So is it kind of us speaking from a pedestal, and is it a little bit insensitive to say, hey, you'd benefit from space without talking about how we build the capacity and how we also focus on those priorities?
I think you are hitting a key element of this conversation, is we come at it from our perspective, and we have to meet the other communities where they are, and we have to recognize their perception, and we have to help work with that perception and bring it forward. Emma pointed out earlier that there's a little bit of view that there's an arrogance, I'll use that term, to be in the space industry. I got a little bit of it on the elevator the other night. Oh, you used to work for NASA? Wow, you must. And then I hear him walking down the hallway going, I just talked to a rocket scientist. And I thought, well, if you knew me, you wouldn't be saying that. But that's indicative of the element that we have to meet people where they are, not come from where we are. And I think that helping them see the opportunities and helping bridge that gap from where they are to where they can be to be part of this is absolutely critical.
Perfect. And so I want to come back to some points we brought up at the beginning. We talked about storytelling. Bryan, you talked about storytelling differently. Emma, you said, let's think differently. And so just before we go to questions here, you are president of the Earth. You get to make all the decisions, and your portfolio is storytelling for space. How are you doing this? What are the details of how you're doing this differently?
Oh, that's a fun thought experiment.
Emma for president.
So I think first is connecting, I sound like a broken record, but it is connecting those dots between people's lives and what we're doing. It is making clear the tie between what you have on your phone in front of you every day, the GPS you use to drive, and what we're doing in space. It is explaining that if you go get LASIK eye surgery, you're using technology that came from space. It is if you sleep on a memory foam mattress. I think that there's something that I would tap into that thread of the tech transfer conversations, because those are a really good way to show people impact in their lives, and then go from there to talk about the slightly more philosophical connections between why the research we do is important, why the basic research in space on the ISS, why the science that's done to understand Venus can have really critical impact here on Earth. But it goes back to just connecting to people's daily lives. We have to meet people where they are and connect from a position of empathy and not arrogance, so that we can build a future that actually brings those communities along, not just in word or tokenization, but through invested action that takes the space industry off of this pedestal and connects with the world.
So stripping away all the technical, but focusing on the non-technical, the human connection and compassion and empathy.
Yeah, I think that we need to bring more of that into what we're doing, so that we can connect with people. I mean, we're all people doing this. We like, as scientists and engineers, we like to think that we're all very, we do things in a very by the book scientific method, no like emotion in it. And I mean, I think that perception can be broken just by the fact that people are so passionate about space. Like there is a lot of emotion at this conference with people who are excited about what we're doing. And being able to tap into that and then draw the technical connections too is a way to bring people with us.
So just reminding everyone we're all just made of stardust.
There's a lot to be said for that.
For sure. Brian.
I mean, I think, as Emma and Dan have said, I think it's about impacting people where they are and enlisting them where they are. I mean, it's not the role of the space industry, to change all the disparities in the world. But I do think there is a real opportunity because this is still such a nascent industry, a nascent, space economy, that we can build that future taking some of the lessons learned down here of how we didn't include different communities, underserved communities, minorities. And it's not just because we're bleeding hearts that we want to do that. It's because if we're really going to advance humanity in space, we have to put our money where our mouth is. I mean, this is humanity. It is what it is. And so I think if I were president of the world, which is a very scary thought,
I'd vote for you.
It's okay, your teenage daughters will keep you in check.
I think they would. They probably wouldn't vote for me. I would try to focus on that. How do we build this future with a team that is different from the team that built all of the last new frontiers?
Great. And so we're gonna go to Dan next, but I'm gonna throw in a wrench because someone from the audience has astutely asked, how are we also convincing a new generation to work on space problems when they may not live to see the results of their multi-generational efforts? So Dan, over to you.
Well, that's an excellent question because it's critical to our future. How do we get the next generation engaged? The one thing I've learned about the current generation is in my faculty days, as well as going around and visiting our student branches and things, is I've learned that the students and the young professionals, the younger generation, they really want to know the why. They want to know the big picture, and they want to understand how what they do is contributing to the benefit of society and all. And we have to draw that connection and help them see it. If we help them see that, and they start to see events like this and other opportunities addressing the why and all the way through the economics and the policy to the technical, then they start to get that connection, and now they start to want to do it. They want to be helpful, they want to be impactful, they want to do it quickly, and we need to open up the doors, give them the opportunity, and continually help them see how it's connected to solving the big challenges, because they're the ones that are going to be most affected by climate change. They're going to be the ones most affected by geopolitical conflict. And we need to be here, at least us more experienced people, we help them see that connection and help build the capacity so that they can move forward quickly.
So that's really powerful. We've talked a lot about the why, but taking it one step further and coming full circle as what are our human needs? What keeps us going in the morning? What's critical to us in terms of survival for ourselves and our children and future generations? So coming back to, after all of this high-tech, infrastructure-related technological talk, just reminding us that we're all humans with the same needs. So I think that's a very powerful element. So one of the most upvoted questions right now, we seem to have riled up the government employees. Sorry, not sorry. Kind of sorry. I'm Canadian, I'm always sorry. There are a lot of government employees here. Do you have any advice other than do better? Anyone?
Wait, say that again?
There are a lot of government employees here. Do you have any better advice than do better?
Well, my dig on the government was more the elected officials than the bureaucrats.
Okay, you guys are fine. We love you. I don't care what we say behind stage.
But Well, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about building the next generation, the government is going to need a next generation too. It's not just the companies. And obviously there's back and forth and, technology transfer, so to speak, in those worlds. But, sometimes I don't think it's as complicated in terms of what you can do. Mentor one or two people, young people. I mean, we all have networks where somebody says, hey, my kid is interested in aerospace. Can you talk to him? Can you get him a tour of the plant? Sometimes those things have more impact than any STEM program you could ever conceive of. And, just think of the numbers. If everybody took the time to mentor one or two or three young kids, a lot of them might take the path that they otherwise wouldn't have taken, and someday will have your job. Long after you're retired and on your government pension, but they will take your job. And I would also, one last point is like, as government employees, you're also in a position not to talk politics, but to talk civics. To your family, to your friends, to your communities. Why does space matter to civics? It does, because as you mentioned, there are players in space that don't think of a future the way we do. They're not democracies. They don't believe in freedom of expression. They don't believe in privacy. And so I think there's a way to, as part of that storytelling, to also inculcate the people around us, our colleagues, our industry partners, the public at large, that this is a race as well for who's going to write the rules of that future. And if we're not, if not first, at least in the race, keeping pace, it's going to be a darker future in some ways, not necessarily a brighter one.
Emma, building on do better. You're doing great, sweetie.
I think that my interpretation of the way that we can do better from the government side, I think I will build on the part that you said about building the next generation. The industry has started to do a lot of really important workforce initiatives to make sure that the next generation is going to reflect the world in terms of its demographic makeup in a way that was not done before, and that is to great success thus far and needs to continue to be invested in. And I think that maybe what's missing from that a little bit is a way to, like, concrete ways to build that from the civic side, and to get people interested in those roles from early stages in their career, and to be thinking about how this all fits together. That's what I would add to that, I guess.
Perfect. Dan?
Well, I guess as the former government employee up here, maybe 3 points. Number one, and this actually in my mind applies beyond just government people, it's about the mission. Let's focus on the mission, let's focus on what we're trying to accomplish, not necessarily focus on or sub-optimize for our own personal gain. I'll start there. Point number 2 is, to Bryan's civics, is particularly from a government perspective, one of the things that helped me get through it was to recognize that there are 536 investors in Washington, D.C. You also have to recognize that Washington, D.C. is what Dan calls the 17-mile wide logic-free zone. And those investors, 435 on the hill, on one side of the House, 100 senators, and then another one down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And if you view them as investors and that they are looking at it from an investment perspective, it helps set the right mindset. Point number 3, and this is the one that I use a lot of places, is I got told one day by my boss's boss that, Dan, you are not here, we do not pay you to do what your boss tells you to do. We pay you to do what is right. Am I clear? Now, he didn't know what he started when he told me that. And every boss I've had since then has had to deal with that consequence. but it's a very telling statement because that came from the Apollo generation. And it was, let's make sure we're doing the right thing, and let's not just go do stuff because somebody said to go do it. Let's make sure we're doing the right thing. And so those 3 lessons are the 3 I would offer up.
Just one quick point on do better. Also make it easier for people to work in the government. I think there's huge disincentive because of just mind-numbing process to get into whether it's NASA or DoD or other government agencies where you can really impact the future in space. I mean, that's a problem government-wide, as you all know, but I feel like I'm just making a little plug. Try to make it a little bit less onerous to go to work for Uncle Sam.
Totally. And to build upon that, I want you, amongst the government employee faction, to remember that you're a faction, but you're not a silo. We are all here as part of the space sector with the same vision of doing tough stuff and great stuff. And so remember to talk to us about your pain points. Maybe we can advocate for you. If you want me to write you a doctor's note to make government regulatory frameworks less onerous, I will do that for you. But we do need to foster these conversations. You know, the whole theme of this conference is collaboration, right? So talking to each other about collaboration, but having honest conversations about pain points and where, you know, the science communicator, the astrophysicist can help the struggling doctor who doesn't know about astrophysics, right? I think that's an important conversation to have. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask the most upvoted question now, okay? But I'm going to up the stakes a little bit. So the question is, what is your go-to answer to a friend who is a space skeptic who asks why invest billions in space? And I'm going to throw a wrench in there saying, you are given a $800 billion portfolio. If you can convince the skeptic, they're in charge of investing in your portfolio in space. So if you can adequately convince them, what do you say to the space skeptic who also controls your funding? Bryan, do you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, one argument that I think a lot of people might understand is it's not really about going there. It's going there to survive here. If we don't go there, if we don't do some of the things we're doing in space, we have less of a chance of surviving in a semi-peaceful, secure world here. Again, it gets back to the opening. This is an ecosystem that we have to get to a point where we're talking about it as one, not either or. And I think we're a long ways from sort of getting there, but I think we're moving in that direction, we're inching in that direction.
Okay. Emma, $800 billion is on the line, no pressure. Go.
Well, all that $800 billion, if they say yes, is going to be invested in Earth. Like, it's not going to be invested, I mean, maybe in the future it'll be invested on the moon, but right now it's being invested right back into Earth's economy.
It's not going to Emma's pocket.
Exactly. And
It's going to Yale, but not your pocket.
Yeah, I think that is an important piece that gets missed in those conversations of like the why spend billions on space, is that that money is going right back into developing a new workforce, investing in these technologies that have impact on the planet. And it is about showing that ecosystem and being able to describe what we are doing as part of an ecosystem. I really like that phrasing because that helps show that when you impact one part of the ecosystem, those effects are going to play out in other aspects of it. If you invest in people who can do the hands-on technical building and hardware assembly, that is investment in a job workforce that is needing that right now. It is not just for us. It's going back to a bigger picture.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And Dan, how are you convincing the skeptic?
So I try to turn it around on them and say, and demonstrate for them as quickly as I can how it's benefiting them personally, what we're already doing.
Yeah.
I have been known to threaten to take people's cell phones away from them, literally. Ask my friends, they've had it done. But also, you know, take a look, okay, what do you use, how do you use, you just went from point A to point B, what did you use to do that? And if they, because one of the things I've tried to recognize is that you've got to connect with the audience. And if you can make it personal to them, sometimes the Venus story works, sometimes the aging story from Space Station works. But if you start to make it personal to them about how they use it every day, and then you can have the rest of the conversation.
Yeah. So if your cell phone goes missing, you know where to look first.
And depending on your audience that you're trying to convince, or the skeptics you're trying to convince, money talks. And so it doesn't hurt if you're on the 17-mile logic-free highway around Washington to talk about jobs.
Right.
To talk about the economy, how this is affecting your state, your district, your future voters in that STEM pipeline. So, I mean, obviously it's not the same message for every skeptical community, but there are definitely common threads that I think, that begins with how does it affect you? Not just you personally, but you politically.
So as we wind down here on time, I want to get into one complex, nuanced question, because we've talked about making the connection, doing it with empathy, making that personal argument for why it would affect who you're talking to, who you're trying to convince. But we talked about the power of storytelling, and backstage we talked about saying words matter. And on stage we've talked about we may not all have the same goals when it comes to going forth into space. The US and it's our collaborators, our ISS partners may have one vision. But notably, let's use the example of the Artemis Accords. Notably, there's 27 signatories last time I checked. There's some notable folks who have not signed, and some might argue the ones who should be the ones signing this. But the layperson in me, the one who reads the Artemis Accords for bedtime reading just for fun, also wonders, did we unintentionally or intentionally politicize this by naming it the Artemis Accords? Those who want their own leadership position in space, by signing on to the Artemis Accords, may be unwittingly endorsing the US position of leadership. So maybe the storytelling should have been the Moon Accords, right? Something less loaded. And maybe that was an intentional position. So should we eat some humble pie as we talk about doing this collaboratively and take away some of our, when I say I'm a Canadian, but from the US point, should we take away some of the US positioning of leadership in the name of collaboration? Do we have to be careful when it comes to the storytelling? I've stunned you all into silence.
I mean, a couple of quick thoughts. I agree in agreements. I mean, I think if you can come up with even non-binding agreements about rules of the road, even with players like China and Russia and other spacefaring powers, it's better than nothing. We're probably not in a position right now where we're going to get any real treaties. Nobody wants to reopen the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. They see that as a can of worms. But I do think that what you're pointing to is just a reminder that this isn't just a game. There are players with real visions of what to do up there and how to do it that are in conflict with ours. I just saw in the news yesterday that Belarus joined the Russian-Chinese version of the Artemis Accords, and so did Pakistan, which doesn't have a very evolved space program yet. But I don't know that that's a great sign. I thought Pakistan was our ally. At least it was in the war on terror. So I just think it's a reminder that we need to be mindful that this is not just about all the cool things we can do in space and how much money we can make.
Sure.
It's also about geopolitics.
But maybe this is a starting point. Maybe we can think of, well, there's two Artemis Accord versions out there. Maybe we can work together to bridge those into one solid accord. So how does storytelling play a role in that?
Well, I think part of it that is a very important thing is that when implicit in signing on to the Artemis Accords is this idea that if you're signing on to a document that is US-led, you're picking a future in space that is based in the democracy that the US espouses and tries to live out. And I think that that is a very important part of this conversation. And if you're picking between the two, it is part of thinking about what is the future we want to build in space. And while I think it is, from a future perspective, really important to think about bringing everybody together, from a geopolitical perspective, right now, we have different ways of operating around the world, and it's which ones of those do we want to be using as a foundation. Maybe we evolve it in certain ways, but as our foundation moving into space. And so I think that there are a lot of very smart people who very carefully decided on the name Artemis, and were very intentional.
Or not. I mean,
I think one
it
of
could
them
be the other way
room,
too.
so.
It could. I would like to think that it was a very well thought out decision, because it is it's an impressive rhetorical strategy nonetheless. So.
Well, knowing Mike Gold and knowing how things work inside the agency, I tend to believe it was more on Emma's line, that there was a lot of discussion and a lot of thought went into it. Bryan, your point's well taken, though. There are occurrences where sometimes the points are missed. But I think this whole discussion points to the need of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and listening to what we're saying and trying to understand the other perception or the other perspective. The value of multiple perspectives in a room helps work these kinds of problems, because words do matter. And I'm not going to go down the road of the rabbit hole of Artemis Accords and the naming. I might ask Mike Gold one day how that all played out, but I'll do that over a beer. But I think we need to, one of the things I think we sometimes go a little too fast on is naming things that we think sounds good, using the words that we know, without thinking about how that's going to be perceived or received on the other side of the communication line. And we need to start more intentionally and consciously thinking through that so that we get to the better place, whatever that is.
Yeah. What a powerful conversation we've had here today. We talked about where we're going, how we can do it for the good of humanity. We've talked about stripping away all our technological ambitions, the silos we exist in, unilateral versus multilateral versus international collaboration. And at the end of the day, doing it by connecting together, focusing on human needs, checking our privilege, going together, making the empathetic, compassionate human connection. And I think that's a perfect place to stop today, because this is a conference about collaboration, and our hope is that this kind of struck a spark in you, that you want to talk to, maybe you don't want to talk to us, maybe you're sick of us, but you want to talk to each other and build those collaborative points together, talk about your pain points, your visions within your own perspectives in space. And so just to ignite one final spark in the last few minutes here, each of you, what is your call to action for the Ascend crowd here today? If you could, light one fire before the conference ends today. Dan, we'll start with you and then we'll go down the row.
Boy, that's a hard one because I can think of so many.
One, Dan.
I think if there's a call to action, I would have, it would be, Shawna, that we as a community get a little bit more realistic about expectations and not overdoing the expectations, and start working the real problems and rolling up our sleeves and working through the problems and working through the challenges, because that's how we're going to make progress. It's going to lead us in different ways, but if there's one thing I would ask is, let's get the expectations in the right regime, technically, politically, economically, and then let's start working, rolling up our sleeves and working the problems, and let's get on with it.
Perfect. Emma, your 30-second answer.
I would say when you're on the plane home or you're driving back from this conference, to think about what inspired you most in the last couple of days. What was your takeaway from it about the future of the space sector? And then think of people in your life who are maybe not in this world, who you can talk about about the things that made you really excited coming away from this week, this couple of days. And then second side of that is, if you are in this industry and in a position to help uplift that next generation, to think about some concrete ways you can mentor, you can engage people who maybe otherwise aren't in the rooms having the conversations about what this future is going to look like, so that we can really build it from this bigger picture of who humanity is, and take that with you.
Bryan, 30-second answer.
I would say in your meetings, internal project reviews, that sort of thing, ask why are we doing this more? Because that why may be different than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. I feel like in all walks of life, especially in very complex organizations, we often just don't ask that. Why are we doing this? And should we be doing this? Or, and if the why has changed, why has it changed? So ask why.
Perfect. There you go. Ascend Day 3 audience. You have your homework. Start those conversations. Do it with meaning. Ask each other why. Enjoy the morning. Give it up for our panelists.